Hey, Lux On Demand family. I am Pastor Andy, also known as Chino Mage, and I am super excited to welcome you to our YouTube channel. Now, normally we do live church services every single Wednesday night over at twitch.tv/Lux Digital Church, starting at 8:30 p.m. EST. It's a whole lot of fun getting the chance to talk with you live and really interact with you there. But our church mainly gathers on Discord, and you'll see the link below and in all of our profiles. We'd love to get the chance to hang out with you week in and week out. But for now, sit back and relax as we get ready for a new talk here on YouTube.
Hello and welcome to Lux Digital Church. My name is Mark and I am the lead pastor here at Lux. Whether you're joining us for the first time or you are here after many times being here before, we're so glad that you're here with us and giving us a portion of your Wednesday night, especially if you're joining us live on Twitch. We are live every Wednesday night at 8:30 p.m. EST at twitch.tv/Lux Digital Church. Well, real quickly, I saw Radiant Emperor, who was new tonight and also followed the channel. Thank you so much for being here. If you're joining us later on as part of our on-demand family, thank you for joining us as well and giving us a portion of your week, investing in your spiritual growth. And if you're on YouTube or on podcast or on Twitch pod, in the panels below or in the description of this episode or video, you will find a link to our Discord server. We'd love to have you come and join us there, where we are 24/7, 365 days a year. Come over and join us and hang out with us over on Discord. Church is not just about spectation, it's about participation. We would love for you to become part of our community and our thriving digital community specifically. Come on over and hang out with us over on Discord. And thanks for being here with us today. We got all kinds of random exclamation points in the chat. Yes, there is exclamation point Mark. I saw an exclamation point Blueprint, Spark. There is an ongoing giveaway tonight. So if you have not hit exclamation point ticket in the chat, feel free to do so. This week, we are in part 3 of a 5-week collection of talks called The Bedroom, My Fortress. And in it, we have a key statement that links all of the messages from this series together in a cohesive way. And it's this: intimacy with God is the fortress where spiritual strength is forged. Intimacy with God is the fortress where spiritual strength is forged. Over the past couple of weeks, we have been taking a look at that concept. Specifically, 2 weeks ago, we talked about how intimacy with God requires a great deal of courage and vulnerability. Last week, Pastor Dalton brought us up to date on David's life. We talked about David and Goliath in week 1 and overall David's life. In week 2 last week, Pastor Dalton talked to us about an epic duo in David and Jonathan in the Bible and the close relationship that they had. And he talked about David's not just close, trusting relationship with Jonathan, but also his close, trusting relationship with God. He brought us into the situation where we saw this continual tension that was rising between David, who was an up-and-coming young general and military commander, and King Saul, Jonathan's father. We saw the tension and the clash that was going on between the two of them. And in each week of this collection of talks, we are talking about a different story from the life of King David, a person who the Bible describes as being a man after God's own heart. Not that he was not without his flaws, because next week Pastor Andy is going to be bringing a message about one of the largest flaws that David had and one of his biggest mistakes that's on full display inside the scriptures. We're going to be talking about that next week. No, there's something else that was about David that made him a man after God's own heart. It wasn't that he wasn't without failure. It wasn't that he wasn't without sin. It wasn't that he was perfect in any way, shape, or form. It wasn't that he followed all of the rules, because he certainly broke many of those. And so it's an encouragement to you and I, who also frequently fail to live up to all of the standards that we see within the pages of the Bible, to learn that it is not living up to a specific set of rules and regulations that make us people after the heart of God, but there is something else, something different about what it means to be after the very heart of God. And we're discovering what it looks like to have that intimacy with God. David had oppressors and opposition on every side throughout the entirety of his life. We explore that throughout this entire series. Yet he also wrote much of the book of Psalms, which is why we've used one of his writings and one of the pieces of his songs or poetry, not just the stories from the book of First Samuel about David's life, but also the writings that he himself had in the book of Psalms. We've had different members of our church who have been reading those. Last week we had Soldier. This week we have somebody new who's going to be reading one of the Psalms for us, one of the stories from David's life, but also the song and the poem that he wrote to go along with it. So all of that to say that we're discovering that as the sort of the story ramps up and David goes from facing Goliath to beginning to face off against Saul, we'll see tonight that that clash really comes to its pinnacle as David gets driven out of the city of Jerusalem and away from his family and into the surrounding Judean wilderness. We're going to dive into that in just a moment. But before we do, I wanted to share another story with you. Now, I personally am not such a huge fan of war movies. Do me a favor, put a 5 in a chat. Like raise your hand. The 5 in the chat, we have 5 fingers on one hand. If we put 5s in the chat, that's clapping. A 5 in the chat is our way of saying, hey, I'm raising my hand. Put a 5 in the chat if you love war movies. If you love war movies, throw a 5 in the chat. Okay, Saving Private Ryan, Druzy, a 5. Big Gun, a 5. Boots loves them. Man, a ray of sunshine. Bick, Dr. Level Up, 0. No, nothing. Just solidarity, no war movies. Xander, Alaska is Strange with a 5. Okay. Diddy the Potato, lots of 5s clapping for war movies. Radiant Emperor likes them. Cap likes them. Miss Amber Dawn is clapping for war movies. Blanco likes war movies. Dragon says sometimes. Yeah. Me? Nah. Yeah. Telly likes war movies. I'm kind of surprised by that. Vindis. Okay. Pete Slayer, 5. Okay. Saying likes them. Control Fangs also. Soldier also likes them war movies. Pilgrim Priest just freaking out for the war movies. Faye Purple Bear. Okay, lots of people saying they like war movies. Weird Audio Guy also raising his hand. I'm not really. Oh, okay, man. Says Star Wars. Okay, yeah, I'm a fan of Star Wars. I'm not a fan of realistic non-sci-fi war movies. I'm not a huge fan of blood. I'm not a huge fan of gore, and I think for the most part, like when I'm going to sit down and watch TV. I very frequently am looking for something like The Office, not Saving Private Ryan. I've actually never seen Saving Private Ryan in its entirety. I've seen clips from it and it's freaked me out. I get really tense. I can't sleep. And so I'm not super in love with war movies. So truth be told, I have not seen this war movie that I'm going to talk about today, but I have read a lot about the story that it covers. And I think it is a really powerful story. The story is the story of a soldier from World War II named Desmond Doss, Doss. Desmond Doss is featured in a movie called Hacksaw Ridge, which in and of itself doesn't even sound like a movie. It sounds like a horror flick, but he's featured in the movie Hacksaw Ridge, which is a fictional war movie, but it's based off a very real movie called The Conscientious Objector. See, Desmond was a soldier. Specifically, he was a military medic and a Christian during World War II. But Desmond refused to carry a gun into the chaos of war. He believed wholeheartedly that God had sent him to World War II to save lives and not to take lives. And inside of the movie and inside of Doss's story, you see many of his soldiers and his commanders that consistently object to, even harass or even persecute him for refusing to carry a gun into a gunfight, which you can imagine does seem a little bit insane. And as one of his fellow comrades, if I was a soldier in World War II alongside of him, I think I would have frequently felt like Desmond was dead weight or unable to defend me, maybe perhaps unable to have my back as my medic, but he refused to carry a weapon. Now, the story gets really interesting because during the Battle of Hacksaw Ridge, the fighting intensified and got really, really bad. And Desmond is known for carrying wounded soldiers out of the battlefield and in and amongst the firefight, lowering them over a cliff with a rope to safety where they could be treated. He saved 75 soldiers during that specific battle. And it is said that the only thing that he would say in and amongst the fighting and the firefight was he consistently prayed over and over again, Lord, help me get one more. He's was the first person who had taken the conscientious objector approach to warfare to receive the Medal of Honor. And David faced, although something maybe not quite or nearly as intense, also, also experienced something similar. And we see it in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 24. After David is kicked out of Jerusalem, we see Saul marching out to come and find him. But to understand why David is kicked out of Jerusalem, we have to understand the dynamic of Israel at the time. So if you would walk with me through a brief history lesson through some of the previous chapters of 1 Samuel and even some of the early chapters of the Bible. The Jewish people trace all of their lineage back to one specific man and his bloodline, specifically Abraham, the father of their faith. Through Abraham, we have Isaac and Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. These 12 sons eventually move to Egypt, where God incubates a nation, and they become the 12 tribes of Israel, each of them bearing the name of one of Isaac's 12 sons. They're brought out of slavery by Moses to possess the Holy Land, and that land is divided up amongst the 12 tribes. They don't have a formal government. They don't have a monarchy. They don't have a ruler. Instead, they establish a theocracy, which means that God had given laws and rules down to Moses, which he handed on to the people, and a grouping of priests would then lead the people and mediate between them and God. This grouping of priests was called the Levites. There was no unifying figure that brought all of the tribes together. They were loosely connected through blood and family lines and possessed the land through a grouping of tribes. Come the book of Judges inside of the biblical storyline, and we have moments when significant individuals would rise to the surface during times of oppression who would lead and unite various different tribes of the ancient Israelites in rebellion. They would overthrow their oppressors, reclaim the land, and then this person throughout their lifetime would take the seat of the judge. Now, the judge means quite literally what you might think it means. It wasn't their heroic exploits in freeing the people. It wasn't their command. It wasn't their war, their capability in war and in battle. It was the fact that they would sit at a seat of judgment each day, and the people of Israel would bring their problems before the judge, and the judge throughout their lifetime would then go through and judge the people. This is how the Israelite people were governed. However, the Israelite people become frustrated with this form of governance because they have no unifying bloodline to draw all of the tribes together. Meanwhile, many of the surrounding nations have kings and royal bloodlines or leaders that help unify the various people groups and organize them. The Israelites consistently cry out for a spiritual leader, but God says they don't need one. Eventually, God gives in and he speaks through a man named Samuel, who appoints a particularly tall Israelite who is reluctant to leadership named Saul. Saul becomes the first leader of the Israelite people, not because he wanted to be. He, in fact, did not want to be the first leader. Now, in most monarchies, what would happen is your child, your son, your oldest son would become the next king of the nation. But in this, it was supposed to work different in Israel. A prophet, or the voice of God to the people, was to anoint the next king. If the current king was faithful to God and obeyed all of God's commands, it may then be his son, and we would establish a legacy from one generation to the next of kings. If the current king disobeyed, then the voice of God, the prophet at the time, would anoint somebody else as the next king of Israel. And here is where we have the story of David and the tension between he and Saul, because Saul had taken things into his own hands, which we'll talk about in just a couple of moments. And so therefore, Samuel eventually anoints David, a man that is not related to Saul in any way. He is the son of a man from a town called Bethlehem, as the next king of Israel. So instead of Saul's son Jonathan becoming the next king, it would be David. This causes all sorts of tension between David and Saul. God blesses David while Saul goes through a crisis. And eventually, Saul absolutely loses it, fires a spirit, David, and then eventually drives him away from his palace and the kingdom, despite David being a loved and a praised political leader and also a military leader in the nation. After that, we see that Saul goes out to hunt down David and to kill him in the wilderness. Let's take a look first at 1 Samuel chapter 24, verses 1 through 2. It says this: After Saul returned from fighting the Philistines, he was told that David had gone into the wilderness of En-gedi. So Saul chose 3,000 elite troops from all Israel and went in search of David and his men near the rocks of the wild goats. And I was actually able to visit En-gedi whenever I was in Israel 2011 and 2012. It was one of the cooler sites that I didn't expect to get a lot out of, but it was pretty freaking amazing. It's called the Crag of the Wild Goats because wild goats literally live in it. And as you're driving down the road, you kind of see it off and up to the right. And it is literally sort of like a cavern. It's not really a cavern, it's like a canyon, a very narrow canyon that is riddled with caves, that's bursting with sort of like stout trees and scrub grass. And up inside of the caves, there's goats and things that live there literally to this day. Now, when I read this story as a child, or I heard it talked about whenever I was growing up, whether my parents told me or I heard about it at a church or youth group or Sunday school or something like that, I oftentimes was really confused about this because I'll be honest, I live in and grew up in Western Pennsylvania. I grew up around a lot of woods, and I was like, why is it so easy to find David? Like, why is David so, like, if I wanted to go hide in the woods, I feel like I could hide for a really long time. I remember, like, as a 9-year-old, like, getting mad at my folks and deciding I was going to run away from home. Like, I had a plan, dude. I had a red wagon, canned goods. I was going to steal canned goods from my mom's kitchen for like weeks ahead of time, like one at a time, so it was never suspicious. And then I was going to load those suckers up inside of a red wagon, and I was going to go in the woods. I was going to take a hatchet. I was going to cut a hole in a tree, and I was going to live inside a tree. I had a full plan for running away from home. And I'm like, David, how hard could it possibly be to run away from home? Well, if you live in the forests of Western Pennsylvania, it could be relatively easy to run from home, but that is absolutely not where Jenny says, excellent plan. Thank you. Absolutely not where David lived. In fact, if you leave Jerusalem today and head south, and specifically, I believe it's southeast is where En-gedi is from Jerusalem, you are immediately in just a barren wasteland. It is red dirt, rocks, thorns, cliffs, and caves. There is nothing out there for you and any grouping of people to be able to survive. There's no water. There's no food. It is alarming as soon as you get outside of Jerusalem and travel south in any capacity. And actually, if you travel north towards Galilee, there is more of that, but a lot of that has been cultivated from water from the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee today, very carefully and very intentionally. Modern Israel has phenomenal modern technology in order to maintain moisture around their plants and their crops. Most of Israel is sort of like a red, dusty, thorny, rocky wasteland. And so when you travel outside of Jerusalem, there's only a couple places you can go where people can live. Like, you're going, it's like red, barren wasteland, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's some green off there in the distance. That must be a place where water occasionally shows up, and that's exactly what it is. Actually, when we showed up at En-gedi, it was one of the few places that we could not climb up into the caves. We got to climb up into the caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found and all those things at Qumran. But we were not allowed to climb up into the caves of En-gedi because it's one of the few places where if it rains in another part of Israel, all of the water funnels down through specifically the channels that lead to En-gedi. And then it can flood the caves and drown people or wash you down the canyon. So we actually weren't allowed to go up. And even if it wasn't raining where you are, you could be in danger of drowning. Now, the Bible actually tells us that David isn't there alone either. In fact, he's traveled with a pretty large group of people after he runs away in fear of Saul, who's trying to kill him. It says that at least 600 sort of malcontent bandits and ruthless men gathered around him. So if you can picture it, David is just kind of like out in the wilderness, living in caves, in one of the only places around that has enough food and water to support any population of people. And with him is now 600 men who are a little, quote, they're rough around the edges, right? These guys are not sort of your model citizens. These are people who are very dissatisfied with the status quo, willing to throw in their hat with someone they feel may be able to lead a rebellion and overthrow the king, despite the king's overwhelming forces. So David is there, but all of a sudden there's a change in events. Saul goes to war with the Philistines, gathers 3,000 elite soldiers, finds out that David is near the caves of the wild goats, the caves of En-Gedi, and he marches down there. Then we have a turn in the story that's quite interesting. Captain Rail, rednecks, maybe, I don't know. I don't know if I should take offense to that or not. Probably not. I'm kind of a redneck, so I kind of grew up in the country. I think my family would self-identify. 1 Samuel 24, 3 through 7, we pick up the story, and it says this. At the place where the road passes some sheepfolds, Saul went into the cave to relieve himself. He had to poop, okay? He had to take a dump. But as it happened, David and his men were hiding farther back in that very cave. So evidently, elite soldiers, not great, not great special, forces. Not real great at securing the cave here. The guys are in the back. Now's your opportunity, David's men whispered to him. Today, the Lord is telling you, I will certainly put your enemy into your power to do with as you wish. So David crept forward and cut off a piece of the hem of Saul's robe. Focus on two things there. Today, the Lord is telling you. Always interesting when other people tell you what God is telling you. And then David crept forward and cut off a piece of Saul's robe. But then David's conscience began bothering him because he had cut Saul's robe. Very strange. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this to the Lord the king. I shouldn't attack the Lord's anointed one, for the Lord himself has chosen him. So David restrained his men and did not let them kill Saul. That's 1 Samuel 24, 3 through 7 in the New Living Translation. So Saul is at David's mercy. Saul is by himself taking a dump in a cave that David and his men currently are occupying. They're further back in the cave, and David could easily strike down his now vulnerable and defenseless pursuer. David has already been chosen to be the next king, and that usually happens through some amount of bloodshed. Yet here is Saul all alone. David can end it now. He can become king. No reason for a battle. He can protect his 600 loyal, rather ruthless men by killing just one. His men whispered to him and said, look, there's Saul. God is telling you justice is at hand. Go and claim the throne. God is telling you. He creeps up. He cuts off the hem of Saul's robe. I don't know if Saul or David rolled a natural 20 on his stealth check and just like crit success. That way he didn't, get found as it's like Paul's, or Saul's like, he's literally like taking a dump and like David's cutting away at his shirt, right? I don't think that's what actually happened. My guess is that Saul had a very nice royal robe on and he didn't want to get, poop on it. And so he probably, he's popping a squat in the cave, but he took his robe off and like he left it off to the side. That way it not get, you don't want your good, you don't want your outer garment to get soiled. You know what I mean? And so David probably crept up. He's like, man, there's Saul's robe. He cuts the edge of it off and that's it. I think this is an incredibly interesting situation, and I have thought for long and hard, why in the heck does David cut off just the hem of Saul's robe? And then why does he come back and feel guilty that he had done it? Certainly there are and can be a lot of cultural implications for it, and there's a lot of different theories out there. I discovered one as I was researching that I think was pretty powerful and for me was pretty convincing. But to look at it, we actually have to backtrack a little bit earlier into Saul's story. You see, Saul had been chosen to be king, like I said before, but he wasn't overly faithful in that. Instead, he actually he accomplishes what God tells him to do. So Samuel comes to Saul and he says, I want you to go and completely wipe out this group of people who are wicked and evil and will deceive you and will ultimately lead the Israelites astray. And then after you do that, here's exactly what I want you to do with all of the plunder from the city that you're going to war with. Saul goes to war. He does the thing that he was told to do. And afterwards, he sort of flexes his kingly authority. Now, you have to understand that not all of the Israelite tribes immediately respected Saul as their king. He was chosen as their king, but it wasn't like there was a long lineage of kingship, of taxes that were being paid. He didn't have a palace, right? He was just loosely the chosen leader of the 12 tribes. And this was really Saul's first genuine test as the leader of the tribes. He unifies the tribes, he gathers soldiers, and he goes to war. This happened many years before the story that we're reading today with Saul and David at the Crags of the Wild Goats and En-Gedi. And whenever Saul goes to battle, he does what he's supposed to do, but he doesn't finish what he's supposed to do in the correct way. Whenever Samuel shows up, Samuel is absolutely livid and ticked. And there's a conflict that happens between the prophet and the new first king of Israel. And then we read what happens as Samuel, the prophet, gets upset and turns to go away. It says this, as Samuel turned to go, Saul tried to hold him back and tore, hear this, the hem of his robe. Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to someone else who is better than you. And he, who is the glory of Israel, will not lie, nor will he change his mind, for he is not human that he should change his mind. 1 Samuel 15:27 through 29. The kingdom had been torn away from Saul, and this was represented by the hem or the edge of Samuel's robe being torn away in Saul's hand. So I believe that David creeps forward into the cave, sees Saul relieving himself, and as a symbolic signature of execution, he cuts the hem off of Saul's royal robe to represent that indeed the kingdom has been totally and completely torn away from him. I don't believe that he goes up to pull it off as some other symbolic gesture. I don't think he's cutting off the hem of Saul's robe as an act of mercy. I don't think that David intended to go one-on-one with the squatting king inside the cave. I believe that David crept forward and he was removing the hem of Saul's robe, the corner of his robe, as a representation that the kingdom had been formally torn out of his hands. Just like all of those years ago, just before Samuel went and found Jesse, and through Jesse, his son David, and anointed him as the next king, as his robe had been torn, and he said to Saul, as my robe has been torn and the corner of it has been ripped off, so the kingdom will be ripped out of your hands. I believe that David is creeping back, not with a sign of mercy in his hand, as the corner of Saul's robe is within his fist, but as a sign of execution. I believe he is going back to his men to say, here, the kingdom has been torn from Saul's hand. Go and kill him. But then David feels convicted. And I have to wonder a little bit about what is wandering through David's head. But I have slightly, maybe a bit of an idea. I imagine David creeping back towards his men at the back of the cave, and in his hand, the hem of Saul's robe. And in his mind, he must be thinking, Saul did the right thing in the wrong way, and it caused the kingdom to be ripped and torn away from him. Here I am, removing the corner of the anointed king of Israel to get the right thing in the wrong way. I am no different than Saul. I'm seeking God's blessing outside of God's plan, shortcutting my way to God's plan for my life. He heard the soldiers and the men whispering in his ear, literally, God is speaking to you. Go and claim what is rightfully yours. to claim what is the right thing in the wrong way. I believe that David is convicted not just of his plan to execute the king, but also in his relationship with God himself, recognizing that he's not trusting God to make him king, but taking the power into his own hands to become king by slaying Saul. And right after this, he comes back to his men and says, hold up, you're not going to kill Saul. I'm actually protecting him, which is a dangerous thing to do to a group of 600 ruthless, rough around the edge men who have aligned themselves with you and are currently hidden in the back of a cave that's being used as a bathroom because there's 3,000 elite soldiers outside being prepared to kill them. And he does what is the absolute most preposterous next step. Saul finishes up, puts his robe back on, doesn't even notice that the corner of it has been cut off, and heads back out to his 3,000 elite soldiers, and David steps up to confess. It says this in 1 Samuel 24, starting in verse 8. After Saul had left the cave and gone on his way, David came out and shouted after him, "My lord the king!" And when Saul looked down, David bowed low before him. Then he shouted to Saul, "Why do you listen to the people who say I am trying to harm you? This very day you can see with your own eyes it isn't true. For the Lord placed you at my mercy back there in the cave. Some of my men told me to kill you, but I spared you. For I said, I will never harm the king. He is the Lord's anointed one. Look, my father, at what I have in my hand. It is a piece of the hem of your robe. I cut it off, but I didn't kill you. This proves that I am not trying to harm you and that I have not sinned against you, even though you have been hunting for me to kill me." Imagine the men that David is leading and the shock in their faces as David announces to their enemies and 3,000 soldiers standing outside their caves where they are cornered and surely ready for slaughter, that he goes out and reveals their location and then confesses, showing the king the hem of his robe, saying, I could have killed you, but I didn't. It was just one order from Saul for the soldiers to march up into the caves of En-Gedi and slaughter David's men. But I don't believe that David, when he was out in the wilderness, I don't believe he just moaned. I don't believe he just planned. I think he prayed. I don't believe that he was just feeling bad for himself. I think he communed with the Lord. I think he knew full well that he could trust God even in the wilderness, even when he was cornered, even when the odds were stacked against him, even when it seemed absolutely preposterous to announce your location to the king and his soldiers, even when it seemed preposterous to Doss to not carry a gun into a firefight, he trusted that the Lord would protect him. And I know that because we actually have it. David wrote one of his Psalms, Psalm number 57, from the very caves of En-Gedi where he was exiled as he hid from Saul and his soldiers who were hunting him. And tonight we have our very own Amber Dawn who's going to be reading for us Psalm number 57.
Have mercy on me, my God. Have mercy on me, for in you I take refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster is past. I cry out to God Most High, to God who vindicates me. He sends from heaven and saves me, rebuking those who hotly pursue me. God sends forth his love and his faithfulness. I am in the midst of lions. I am forced to dwell among ravenous beasts, men whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. They spread a net for my feet. I was bowed down in distress. They dug a pit in my path, but they have fallen into it themselves. My heart, O God, is steadfast. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and make music. Awake, my soul. Awake, harp and lyre. I will awaken the dawn. I will praise you, Lord, among the nations. I will sing of you among the peoples, for great is your love, reaching to the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the skies. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. Psalms 57.
David says in this psalm that his heart is confident in God, even in the wilderness, exiled from his home, surrounded by ruthless bandits and rabble-rousers, people that he normally wouldn't have trusted. Previously, he lived within a beautiful walled city, a respected commander, with his wife and with his family. He was the apple of the eye of so many people in the city of Jerusalem, their hope for a future, the anointed second king of Israel. He's driven from society, driven from his family, driven from his soldiers, and out in the wilderness, he's surrounded by a bunch of men that he probably would have ended up battling or, dealing with at some point as king. Instead, these are the men that are surrounding him. He's living in the wilderness, living off the land, and even in this place as he's being hunted by his mentor, by the king of Israel, by his best friend's dad. Even as he's being hunted, he says he is confident in the Lord. God had anointed him to be king of Israel. He didn't doubt that that would happen. And when the moment came up for him to grab revenge and claim kingship through the blood of the anointed current king of Israel, he had men whispering in his ear, God is telling you. But claiming God's blessing through ways that are contrary to God's ways isn't trusting the Lord, it's shortcutting him. I think many of us in life look for ways to shortcut the ways of God to the blessings of the Lord. We would like the good part, but we don't want to trust him in the process to get there. But the currency of God's kingdom isn't money. It isn't people. It's not even churches. The currency of God's kingdom is the faith of his people. It is people who trust in the ways of the Lord. It is people who will say, even if I don't understand fully, God, what you're doing, I trust that if I follow in your ways, that you will provide the way forward. I'm not going to shortcut to your blessing through blood. I will trust you. I'll stand in the mouth of the cave and reveal my presence to the men, the soldiers that are hunting me, if it means that I am trusting you, Father. There are times in life that we must have faith and we must trust the Lord in order to develop a closer and more intimate relationship with him. There are times in life when we are in the wilderness that instead of moaning or complaining or looking for a way out, we need to go to worship and to prayer. There are times when we are surrounded and it seems like everything is closing in, that instead of fighting back, we need to turn to worship. There are moments that are difficult in life where we feel like there's no way out, where the only way out is what God will provide. And there are times in life when the world will present us shortcuts to good things that God desires for our life, but these shortcuts are done in ways that are contrary to God's will. And let me just tell you, a shortcut contrary to God's will always result in something worse for us than if we trust God, even if it doesn't make sense or it isn't apparent how he will provide a way forward in that moment. I believe that it is this moment in David's story that makes a profound impact on the rest of his leadership and rulership. If you don't know this, there are hundreds of men called David's mighty men that surround him and form his personal bodyguard once he assumes the throne in Israel one day. After Saul is killed and David becomes king, many of those mighty men are the very men that are in these caves in En-Gedi. The ruthless men that were discontent with the status quo that gathered with him in the wilderness become the very men that stand with him and guard his life. I believe that if David had taken the life of Saul in that cave in En-Gedi, it may have not been long before these same men that he gathered with would have sought to take his own life, David's life, when they were dissatisfied with him. Many of the kingdoms that surrounded Israel that transitioned king to king in a line of blood and brutality, which oftentimes happened in Israel later during the reign of more evil and wicked kings, always seemed that a king who gained their position and their rulership through blood had their rulership ended in blood and violence as well. I believe that the decision to withhold the hand of vengeance and violence against Saul formed inside this group of men a form of reverence, respect, and loyalty to David that allowed them to take steps in faith into unbelievable and heroic, nearly supernatural exploits of courage and battle prowess later in David's story and in his line in rulership. I believe it is these mighty men that saw David's faithfulness and loyalty to the Lord in a cave that was being used as a bathroom that forged their allegiance and their loyalty to him as he sat on the throne in Jerusalem. We never know what trusting the Lord, even when it doesn't immediately make logical sense to us at the time, will do. David refused to make a shortcut of blood to God's blessing, and I think it sets an example for us as well. The path forward to what God has for us is not through shortcuts, and it's not outside of his will. It is through a deep faith and trust in the Lord. It's not through complaining while in the wilderness or moaning while we are surrounded, but it is in worship and utter dependence on the Spirit of God and the Holy Spirit in our lives. It is total surrender to Jesus. If we desire an intimate relationship with God that mimics anything like what David has, we have to be willing to follow Jesus and follow the will of God in our life, even when other people are whispering, see, this path of vengeance and blood is God's word to you. God is speaking to you. We have to be willing to tune our ear not to the people that are surrounding us in the back of our caves, but instead to the voice of God and to his word, that we would live in accordance with his ways, even when it doesn't logically make sense to us at the time because we can't see the whole picture. Faith is the currency of God's kingdom. It always will be. It's trusting God to deliver on his promises in his time, and we choose to live in a way that is aligned with his will. All that takes us to our why it matters point tonight, and it's our closing for tonight's message. It's this: sometimes we must trust God even when it seems unreasonable. Sometimes we must trust God even when it seems unreasonable. There are times in life when I have had to trust God even when I couldn't see the path forward. There are times in life where different seasons where Jen and I looked forward and we said, I don't see how we're going to start this church. It doesn't make any logical sense that it could work. Very few people have ever done it or done it well. I don't think it will work, but we think that God is asking us to do it. We've seen seasons where we felt like God was asking us to financially sacrifice in a way that we had never financially sacrificed before. And we looked at the numbers and we said, I don't know that we can do it. And I'm not sure that we can make it work. And every single time, God has very clearly shown that his blessing is on the other side of faithfulness, even if it doesn't make sense at the time. Sometimes we must trust God even when it seems unreasonable. So, are you in En-Gedi? Are you in the back of your cave? Is your cave surrounded with somebody pooping in the front of it? Where do you feel outnumbered and cornered? When you're given the opportunity to get the right thing in the wrong way, do you find yourself trusting God and taking things into your own hands? I bet some of us will have a chance this week to get the right things in the wrong way. Will you trust God enough to say and echo David's words and say, like in the Psalm, my heart is confident in you, O God, and choose to trust God in your intimacy with him and don't take the shortcut of blood to his blessing. My prayer is that each of us will draw close to God this week and that truly, deeply, we will trust him. Even if we have people whispering in our ear at the back of the cave, this is God's will. He's speaking to you. This is God's plan. Will you trust God's ways over what sometimes looks to us to be the easy way or the right way? Let's pray. Father, I love you and I thank you. I pray, God, that for each of us, that we would experience a deep and ever-growing faith that enables us to trust you, even when we don't see the path forward immediately, even when it doesn't make sense, even when it might feel unreasonable. I pray, God, that we don't shortcut to your blessing. I pray, Father, that we trust that you will fulfill your promises and your commitments. that you'll come through. We don't need to make a shortcut to get to it, that you'll provide the way. We love you, Lord, and we thank you. In your name we pray. Amen.
All these pieces broken and scattered, in mercy gathered, mended and whole, empty-handed but not forsaken, have been set free, have been set free. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Oh, I once was lost, but now I am found. Was blind, but now I see. Oh, I can see you now. Oh, I can see the love in your eyes, laying yourself down, raising up the broken to life. You take our failure, you take our weakness, you set your treasure in jars of clay. So take this heart, Lord, I'll be your